The first Japanese dive bomber appeared over Pearl Harbor at 7:55 a.m. local time. It was part of a first wave of nearly 200 aircraft, including torpedo planes, bombers, and fighters. Within a quarter of an hour, the various airfields at the base were subjected to savage attack. Due to Short's anti-sabotage measures, the U.S. military aircraft were packed tightly together at the Naval Air Station on Ford Island and adjoining Wheeler and Hickam fields, and many were destroyed on the ground by Japanese strafing. At Wheeler Field in particular, the destruction was fearful. Of the 126 planes on the ground, 42 were totally destroyed, 41 were damaged, and only 43 were left fit for service. Only 6 U.S. planes got into the air to repel the attackers of this first assault. In total, more than 180 aircraft were destroyed. At the same time, a massive action was directed against Kimmel's fleet. The ships anchored in the harbor made perfect targets for the Japanese bombers, and, because it was Sunday morning, a time chosen by the Japanese for maximum surprise, they were not fully manned. Most of the damage to the battleships was inflicted in the first 30 minutes of the assault. The battleship USS Arizona blew up with a tremendous explosion. Riddled with bombs and torpedoes, the USS West Virginia settled on an even keel on the bottom of the harbor. The USS Oklahoma, hit by 4 torpedoes within 5 minutes, rolled completely over, with its bottom and propeller rising above the waters of the harbor. The USS California, the flagship of the Pacific Battle Force, was torpedoed and ordered abandoned as it slowly sank in shallow water. The target ship USS Utah also was sunk. Hardly a vessel escaped damage. The anti-aircraft crews on the various vessels were fairly prompt in getting into action, and Army personnel fired with what they had, but the force of the attack was in no serious way blunted. At 8:50 a.m. the second wave of the attack began. Less successful than the first, it nonetheless inflicted heavy damage. The battleship USS Nevada had sustained a torpedo hit during the first wave, but its position at the end of Battleship Row allowed it greater freedom of action than the other moored capital ships. It was attempting to get underway when the second wave hit. It was struck by 7 or 8 bombs and was grounded at the head of the channel. The battleship USS Pennsylvania was set ablaze by bombs, and the 2 destroyers moored near it were reduced to wrecks. The destroyer USS Shaw was split in 2 by a great explosion. Shortly after 9 a.m. the Japanese withdrew. No one could doubt that the Japanese had gained a great success. The Arizona and the Oklahoma were destroyed with great loss of life, and 6 other battleships suffered varying degrees of damage. 3 cruisers, 3 destroyers, and other vessels were also damaged. U.S. military casualties totaled more than 3,400, including more than 2,300 killed. Heavy damage was inflicted on both Army and Navy aircraft on the ground. The Japanese lost from 29 to 60 planes, 5 midget submarines, perhaps 1 or 2 fleet submarines, and fewer than 100 men. The Japanese task force retired from the theater of battle without being attacked. There was, however, one consoling feature to the tragedy. As a result of the dispositions made by Kimmel, 2 U.S. aircraft carriers were not in the harbor. The USS Enterprise, under ADM William F. Halsey, was on a mission to reinforce the Wake Island garrison with Marine planes and aviators. The USS Lexington was undertaking a similar mission to ferry Marine dive bombers to Midway. These operations also meant that 7 heavy cruisers and a division of destroyers were at sea. The Enterprise was scheduled to return to Pearl Harbor on December 6 but was delayed by weather. A third carrier, the USS Saratoga, was embarking a fresh complement of aircraft in San Diego on the morning of the attack. The Pearl Harbor attack severely crippled U.S. naval and air strength in the Pacific. However, of the 8 battleships, all but the Arizona and Oklahoma were eventually repaired and returned to service, and the Japanese failed to destroy the important oil storage facilities on the island. The date which will live in infamy, as U.S. President Franklin D. Roosevelt termed it, unified the U.S. public and swept away any earlier support for neutrality. On December 8, Congress declared war on Japan with only one dissenting vote, Representative Jeannette Rankin of Montana, who had also voted against U.S. entry into World War I. The extent of the disaster and the unpreparedness of the U.S. military provoked considerable criticism and led to numerous investigations. Both Kimmel and Short were relieved of duty, and, almost immediately after the assault, the President appointed a commission headed by U.S. Supreme Court Justice Owen J. Roberts to examine the facts and to fix responsibility. At a later date, both Army and Navy boards reviewed the problem. In 1946, a full-scale congressional investigation took place. Prior to the September 11, 2001, attacks, probably no episode in U.S. military history was so thoroughly examined, and on none has a wider divergence of opinion been expressed. The most extreme view of the disaster is not to be found in any of the numerous investigations, but was disseminated long after the tragedy by those supporting the so-called backdoor to war theory. Among the earliest and most prominent exponents of this theory was Rear ADM Robert A. Theobald, a Pacific Task Force commander whose career was sidelined after he clashed with superiors and failed to challenge the Japanese attacks on Attu and Kiska in the Aleutians. In The Final Secret of Pearl Harbor, 1954, Theobald asserted that Roosevelt, by unrelenting diplomatic pressure, enticed Japan to initiate hostilities with a surprise attack by holding the Pacific Fleet in Hawaiian waters as an invitation to that attack. This position found little support among mainstream historians at the time, and declassified documents relating to the capabilities and limitations of U.S. code-breaking efforts would serve to further undermine the backdoor theory. Roosevelt did indeed pursue a policy of support for nationalist China which acted as a substantial irritant to the Tokyo government and did much to provoke it to action. At the same time, there is substantial evidence that he sought to postpone a clash, rather than to incite one, and even in the closing days of the negotiations he made an appeal to Japanese Emperor Hirohito, which, if listened to, might have had that effect. Those who defend the position of the Hawaiian commanders make the following points. Short replied to Marshall's warning of November 27, Department alerted to prevent sabotage. When this reply passed over the Chief of Staff's desk, he neglected to notice that it mentioned only this one kind of preparation, as did General Leonard T. Gero, his subordinate. At no time in the next 10 days was this neglect repaired. As for Kimmel, the point has been made that he was inadequately informed as to the seriousness of the crisis. In the months before Pearl Harbor, the armed services, through the breaking of the Japanese code, were able to get much information as to Japanese purposes. Not a small part of this related to the position of the naval forces in Hawaii. Kimmel himself claimed that had he been put in possession of this material, he would have taken far stronger measures than he actually did. In defense of his failure to undertake more vigorous measures of reconnaissance, he urged the importance of his training program and the limited nature of his resources. The critics of Washington also asserted that by the evening of December 6 the president had clear evidence that war was impending and that he should have taken prompt measures to alert the War and Navy departments. This view attached little importance to the warnings of November 27. The success of the attack on Pearl Harbor was primarily due to the Americans' false estimate of the enemy's capabilities and intentions. The authorities in Washington knew that the Japanese forces were moving southward into the Gulf of Thailand. They did not believe that coincident with this move the Japanese could or would mount an attack on the Hawaiian base. It seemed logical, too, that the Japanese would avoid such action because it would inevitably bring the United States into the war. Operations in the Pacific directed against the British and the Dutch might not have had this effect. The possibility of an air attack on Pearl Harbor had been frequently discussed among U.S. military planners in the course of the year, but as matters came to a crisis, for the reasons mentioned above, it fell into the background. It is a difficult matter, and one on which divergent opinions will long be held, to apportion responsibility between Washington and the commanders on the spot. In a report presented only a few weeks after it had been appointed by Roosevelt on December 17, 1941, the Roberts Commission placed the principal blame for the disaster upon Kimmel and Short. The Army and Navy commissions which later examined the problem took a contrary view, throwing the blame on the War and Navy departments. The majority report of a congressional committee, rendered in 1946, while not avoiding criticism of the Chief of Naval Operations and the U.S. Army Chief of Staff, stressed the lack of preparation in Hawaii. Two members of this committee strongly dissented, severely blaming the authorities in Washington, and a third took a kind of middle ground. Those who defend the position of the Hawaiian commanders make the following points. Short reply to Marshall's warning of November 27, Department alerted to prevent sabotage. When this reply passed over the Chief of Staff's desk, he neglected to notice that it mentioned only this one kind of preparation, as did General Leonard T. Gero, his subordinate. At no time in the next 10 days was this neglect repaired. As for Kimmel, the point has been made that he was inadequately informed as to the seriousness of the crisis. In the months before Pearl Harbor, the armed services, through the breaking of the Japanese code, were able to get much information as to Japanese purposes. Not a small part of this related to the position of the naval forces in Hawaii. Kimmel himself claimed that had he been put in possession of this material, he would have taken far stronger measures than he actually did. In defense of his failure to undertake more vigorous measures of reconnaissance, he urged the importance of his training program and the limited nature of his resources. The critics of Washington also asserted that by the evening of December 6 the president had clear evidence that war was impending and that he should have taken prompt measures to alert the War and Navy departments. This view attached little importance to the warnings of November 27. Those who were critical of the commanders on the spot took the view that the warnings given were sufficient and that a deplorable lack of imagination was shown in acting on them. A rash of questions are raised. Why was the possibility of an air attack not taken into account? Why were Short's airplanes drawn up in such fashion as to be most exposed to enemy attack? Why was the radar training program not more advanced? Why did Kimmel handle his schedule so that the Japanese could count on all the battleships being in port on Sunday? Why were normal weekend leaves and liberties granted? Why was not some attempt made to improve reconnaissance? Why was the report on the Japanese submarine not taken more seriously? Those who emphasize the responsibility of Kimmel and Short also call attention to the fact that the war warnings of November 27 brought much more vigorous action on the part of the commanders in the Canal Zone and the Philippines.